One man who won't buy it is Isa Ali, journalist and analyst, who joins us now. Isa, wonderful to see you again. It's not that we're saying there's no reason for anger in Iran, is it? There's plenty of reasons for anger. It's that the Americans are involved in a regime change operation in Iran. That's the bigger question, isn't it?
Absolutely. And of course, again, thank you firstly for welcoming me on the show, George. It's great to see you. And of course, in your introduction, you spoke of how this country that we're in now used to be many years ago and how things are in Iran. And so I guess the first place to start would be, imagine living in this country with the wealth that the top 0.1% of the country have gathered for themselves over the last 40 years of neoliberalism, the amount of inequality, the amount of pressure, and then add that to if this country had been under sanctions and war, and then had channels from abroad beaming in propaganda non-stop 24/7, you might get an idea of the kind of pressure cooker that Iranian society has become and what it's been subjected to. And of course, there are many factors here at play, and there are many people who in particular support Iran, they support the Islamic Republic, they support the system there, but are also very critical of the internal factors, perhaps mismanagement in some economic sectors, corruption, and other things. But all of that doesn't take away from the fact that, of course, this is very simply yet the latest chapter in the American government's and Israel and Saudi Arabia attempts to launch a color revolution or a color coup in Iran, because of course they can't do it militarily. Iran's too strong militarily. They can't do it perhaps through the usual way of maybe a military coup, because in particular the leader of Iran, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, is too respected, too popular, and has the control of the Revolutionary Guards, who are fiercely loyal to him. And so that leaves a color revolution, which has two purposes, really. Of course, to destabilize the country, and also to cause a cleavage in society as well, because it's essentially a culture war that's being waged in Iran by the West. It is a war which is being waged on the level of, for example, the issue of the hijab, which, regardless of your views of whether or not you think, guidance patrols or morality police or whatever you name them, if they should exist or not, there are many fiercely conservative people in Iran, and there are some very many liberal people in Iran, and these kind of issues just tear society further apart. The pressure put on by things like sanctions don't help, and I'm not sure if the Americans are really hopeful of overthrowing the Iranian government as such, because they should know, unless they're idiots, that it's next to impossible. The government still has too much domestic support, people who are willing to go out onto the streets. And I think one thing that's been marked by the last 3 weeks or so of unrest in the country is that Sayyid Ali Khamenei hasn't spoken. He hasn't come out and given a speech. And there are many people in Iran, even his fiercest opponents, who recognize that if he wanted to, all he would have to do is say a few words, and that would be the end of all of this chaos. But I think he recognizes as well that a lot of this anger is rooted in legitimate grievances. There's fierce debate even within conservative segments of society as to whether President Raisi should have reactivated these so-called morality patrols or not. So, it's not a question of, people are religious or not religious, or whatever their views are on the hijab or on the role of religion and the state. There's a lot of there's plenty of healthy debate going on inside Iran, plenty of criticism going on inside Iran, away from all of these attempts to destabilize the country, destroy the country. We've been seeing ambulances and fire brigades, fire engines set on fire, the kind of things that if they happened here, people would be outraged and would say, what's this got to do with the protests? And it's the same there. We're seeing these kind of things taking place, and I'm just not too sure what effect that's going to have in terms of the popularity of that movement going forward.
I didn't realize that Khamenei hadn't spoken. That's a very good point you've made there. But something else that hasn't been noticed by most, because it's never been shown, is that while there are substantial protest demonstrations, they are dwarfed exponentially by demonstrations by supporters of the regime in Tehran. Tell us a bit about that.
I think the first place to start is when you look at Iran and its history, and in particular the legacy of Saddam's war against Iran, it's that you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are the children or the grandchildren or the widows of men who went, in some cases, running into minefields with nothing but their faith armed with them, and who died for the sake of their country, who died for the sake of the Islamic Revolution, who died to protect their people from the harms that undoubtedly would have come if Saddam had been successful. So there are many people in the country who, regardless of things like standards of living, corruption, mismanagement, all the other things that are aside from the external factors waging war on Iran, these people are deeply critical of all of these things, but when it comes to the crunch, they know which side their bread is buttered on. And there's no way they're going to stand for the kind of rioting and the kind of things we've seen. And so we've seen huge protests on the street. There's another factor here as well. The armed elements, which are trying to start a civil war, similar to how Syria started, and are trying it in Iran. In Zahedan, I've just seen some footage of the city of Zahedan, where the place just is essentially everything's all burnt down, everything's all bombed out now. The government and the security forces have regained control of the city. But just imagine, we've seen protests recently, and protests are going to get worse in Europe, by the way. We've seen in Germany huge protests against the decision to essentially sanction themselves rather than sanctioning Russia. We're seeing people burning their bills in this country. Imagine these protests grow out of control as they might do these coming months in the winter. And then an armed group tries to take over Bristol or tries to take over Liverpool. I want to see how the media would frame that as freedom movement, or would they say, actually, hang on a second, these are terrorist groups trying to take over parts of the country, and that's essentially what's happening. And so within Iran, people won't stand for that. Hundreds of thousands of people have already come out onto the streets, and again, they've come out onto the streets without kind of being prompted to. There's this cliche that people who protest for the government are being paid or forced out of their jobs. But in situations like this, where people are very openly protesting against the government, nobody needs to do that. There are very clear lines being drawn within Iranian society. I think what's more concerning for the Iranian government isn't actually the protests themselves. They're not really that big. It's more the social issues, university lecturers speaking out, or perhaps not wanting to take their classes and going on strike, actors and celebrities and so on. Now, people will dismiss them as, just being kind of a privileged class, chasing clout, if you will. But, there are real problems there for the Iranians beyond the protests. And I think that's where they have to try to perhaps marry those two sides within society, because, it's growing more acrimonious. Both kind of wings of society, if you will, are starting to hate each other even more. There's one part that feels we're being oppressed, we don't want to live by these rules. There's another side which say, how dare you, we fought, or our parents fought and died for this country and for this system, and you don't respect them at all. So there is that sense of a division in society. Having said all of that, if Israel or Saudi Arabia or anyone else gets any stupid ideas and thinks this is a good time to attack Iran, they will see Iranian society rallying around the flag very quickly, because no matter what the problems people have within themselves in that country, it's a very fiercely nationalistic country, and people shouldn't be fooled by the rhetoric of Masih Alinejad and all these other CIA and State Department sponsored actors from outside telling them, we need Western help, we need more sanctions, we need more people to die of cancer so that they get angry and their families get angry and rise up. We need airstrikes. Anything that comes from outside will only serve to rally people in the country against the outside threat. And I think it's important people understand it from that angle as well.
An uprising of the kind you described is exceedingly unlikely in Bristol. In Liverpool, not so much. Thanks very much, Isa Ali, for joining us.